The most feared inmate in prison. Charles Bronson was a British criminal who had been repeatedly described as the most violent prisoner in Britain and the Britain's most notorious prisoner. He is renowned as one of the scariest men to have ever lived. This is because even in the toughest and darkest prisons, no one was able to control him, and there was no way that his vicious behavior could be dealt with in any kind of prison, which is why, throughout his years of imprisonment, he was always transferred from one prison to another. Now, let's take a look at the history of Charles Bronson and what may have led him to be one of the most terrifying people alive. History of Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was born on the 6th of December in Luton, Bedfordshire, and was originally named as Michael Gordon Peterson. You may find it hard to believe, but Charles Bronson was born and brought up in a stable family. Unlike many other hardened criminals who were victims of domestic abuse or brought up in a toxic environment, whereas Charles Bronson was one of Ira and Joe Peterson's 3 sons. His father ran the Aberystwyth Conservative Club, and in the 1960s and 1970s, his uncle and aunt were both mayors of Luton. Surprisingly, Eileen Parry, his aunt, is reported to have said he was a lovely young man. He was obviously bright, and he was always good with kids. He was gentle and mild-mannered, never a bully, and always stood up for the weak. This clearly indicates that Charles was a good kid parented by good parents, and yes, some may even call him an ideal child. But then why was he imprisoned for years? Peterson grew up in Luton, but when he was a teenager, his family relocated to Ellesmere Port, Cheshire, which is where he began to get into trouble. He was part of a gang of 4 robbers by the age of 13 and was rebuked in juvenile court after being caught stealing. He also began fighting at a young age and was frequently absent from school. Bronson later returned to Luton, referring to it as his hometown, and got his first job at Tesco, where he worked for a couple of weeks before being fired for assaulting his manager. He worked as a hod carrier and in various factories throughout his career, but only for a short period of time. He was imprisoned for the first time at Risley, where he was serving time on trial for criminal damage due to bashing some parked cars after a dispute with his girlfriend's father. Following his conviction, he was fined and sentenced to probation. Charles Bronson's crimes. Charles Bronson's journey started with petty crimes, and then eventually it led to him committing armed robbery in 1974, when he was just 22 years old and was punished with 7 years of imprisonment. He was taken to Walton Prison, and given his anger issues, he soon ended up on the punishment block after provokedly striking 2 detainees. Pretty daring, right? In 1975, he was transferred to Hull, and after refusing jail employment, he ripped up a workshop and was sent to the punishment block after an incident with a prison warden. In an attempt to shoot down his wild behavior, he was given the sedative chlorpromazine, which made him dangerously ill, and his sentence was then lengthened by 6 months. From the looks of it, Charles Bronson seemed like the kind of guy who liked getting into trouble, because even after his recovery, he continued to be a difficult inmate and was regularly kept in solitary confinement for several months. After his release from isolation, he attacked another inmate with a glass jug and was charged with grievous bodily harm. However, these charges were dropped, but 9 months was added to his sentence, and he was transferred yet again. The transfers to prison. This was for sure not going to be his last transfer, as between 1975 and 1977, he was transferred to many prisons like Wakefield, Parkhurst and Walton prisons, and there's even more to his manoeuvres. He was even chained to the floor of a prison van, and hence created a reputation for being so terrifying and uncontrollable that in order to protect the other prisoners and prison guards, he was mostly kept in solitary confinement, so there would be no interaction or physical violence. In isolation, he decided to work on his physical health. However, when he was let out of isolation, he assaulted other inmates and even caused damage to prison property without showing any remorse whatsoever. Bronson's wife even handed him the divorce papers when he was recovering from a beating he received from punching 2 officers. Let's be real though, who wouldn't divorce a crazy guy like him? He even attempted to poison the prisoner in the cell next to him at Wandsworth, which is why he was transferred to Parkhurst Prison in 1976, where he encountered the Cray twins, who he regarded as the best two guys I've ever met. But after threatening to kill a jail official, he was transferred back to Wandsworth and was imprisoned there for 4 months because the rebellious inmate got caught digging his way out of his cell. After being restored to the general population of the prison, he tracked down the prisoner who had snitched him of his escape plan and attacked him. Due to his crazy amount of incidents and attempts at suicide, the authorities decided to put him into a psychiatric hospital. Bronson arrived at Broadmoor in December 1978, but was quickly transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital, where he was unable to adjust to forced medication and surrounded by severely disturbed and violent patients. Bronson attempted to strangle a child rapist and murdered John White. He was arrested just as White released his death rattle and was brought back to Broadmoor, which got him to reunite with his pal Ronnie Cray. The failure to strangle John White may have got him in over his head, as he again tried to strangle Gordon Robinson, but couldn't as the silk tie he was strangling him with tore. This made him depressed, but Ronnie Cray's arrangement for boxer Terry Downs to visit him helped him feel better. In 1982, after making it to the top of Broadmoor, he staged his first rooftop protest, tearing off the roof tiles. He again made it to the Broadmoor's roof not long after the initial event. After a 3-day protest, he caused £250,000 worth of damage before his family talked him down. He received more treatment and started creating paintings. He eventually won more prizes for his poetry, prose, and drawings than any other prisoner, but later demanded a prison transfer during his 3rd rooftop protest and was unsuccessful. To do so, he started an 18-day hunger strike, and in June 1984, he was finally allowed to transfer to Ashworth Hospital. Despite his demand being granted, he returned to his previous behavior and stabbed another patient for making sexual advances towards him. He was moved to Albany, where he punched another convict on his first day in general jail population. He struck another offender and was quickly transferred to Wormwood Scrubs and returned to Wandsworth 2 weeks later. Bronson was moved 8 times in 1986, with the only new location being Winchester. After a particularly violent incident, he strangled Wormwood Scrubs governor. He was then transferred to Gartree on the 3rd of January 1987, where he served the remainder of his term in isolation. Release from prison. After being freed from prison, Bronson pursued a brief career as a bare-knuckle boxer in London's East End. Bronson robbed a jewellery store in 1988 and was arrested a week later. His defence appeared to be strong at first, since eyewitnesses were unwilling to testify against him. That is, until his girlfriend at the time became the prosecution's major witness. Bronson pleaded guilty to armed robbery in June 1988. With no alibi and evidence piled against him, was sentenced to 7 years in prison again. While in prison, Bronson lived up to the reputation he earned during his previous sentence by fighting with prisoners and prison guards and destroying the prison equipment. After a while, Bronson took 3 inmates hostage in a cell while incarcerated in Belmarsh in April 1996, adding 7 years to his sentence. Bronson has previously kidnapped hostages in prison, including a doctor in Birmingham, Deputy Governor Adrian Wallace in Hull, and the Deputy Governor in Frankland. This scary man was even handed a life sentence after he took another person hostage, prison teacher Phil Danielson, who he held for 44 hours in Hull prison. Later in 1999, law enforcement did what they should do from the start. They set up a special prison unit just for him, and in 2001, he got married to a Bangladeshi woman and converted to Islam for her, but they got divorced after a few years and he renounced his faith and was later moved to Wakefield. He continued being violent and changed his name to Charles Salvador. He also continued making art and then proposed to an actress, but this led to another one of his failed marriages because she was found dead in her own home. In 2021, he got famous for being the single maddest man and even had a film made about him and his crazy journey throughout imprisonment. So there you have it, everything regarding the most feared inmate in prison. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button.